If you ask a lot of people here in England, the reason why there are so few black football managers is simply because they're not very good. Many football fans will point to the likes of Terry Connor during his interim spell in charge of Wolves, Paul Ince at Blackburn Rovers, or Jimmy Floyd Hasselbank at Queen's Park Rangers and say, see, they do get jobs, they just weren't getting results, so like anyone else they were sacked. Chairmen and owners just want results. They don't care about the skin colour of the person getting those results. Of course, there is some truth to that. No one, or virtually no one, is suggesting that if Jermaine Defoe got the Barnet job tomorrow and took the Bees all the way from the National League up to the Premier League in 4 seasons before qualifying for the Champions League, all without increasing Barnet's budget from their non-league days, that the club's owners would be likely to turn around and sack him just because he's black and replace him with Steve Bruce instead. The reality, however, just taking the Premier League as one example for now, though it is a particularly notable one, as the biggest, richest and most watched league in world football, 43% of Premier League players are from black or other ethnic minority backgrounds, yet at the end of last season, there wasn't a single black manager in the entire division. To be clear then, just in case anyone was struggling with the maths on that one, that is 43% of Premier League players coming from black or ethnic minority backgrounds and 0% of managers. There will be one black manager in the Premier League at the start of next season, namely Vincent Kompany, though only because he managed to win promotion from the Championship with Burnley last season, but that still only equates to a measly 5%, which is nowhere near reflective of the makeup of the Premier League as a whole. Either you believe in supreme and seemingly permanent coincidences then, or something else must be going on. So often this debate or discussion gets boiled down into 2 deeply entrenched camps, arguing either that the lack of black managers is entirely the fault of black coaches themselves because they are inherently incapable of becoming good managers or just don't want to, as though it were somehow hardwired into their DNA that they can be great players and succeed in just about every other field, but coaching and management is just beyond them, or that the lack of black managers is the result of virulent anti-black racism amongst the chairmen, owners and CEOs of football clubs who flat out refuse to employ black people as managers, despite having no qualms about employing them as players, and therefore black managers don't get any opportunities. You may be able to tell from my tone of voice that I'm not entirely convinced by either of these commonly adopted positions, hence why I am making a video exploring what I believe to be the actual reasons why there are so few black managers in the Premier League, the EFL, and throughout most of European football. If you listen to a lot of older or retired black footballers, they'll tell you that they never even considered coaching, or at least not at the highest level, as a viable option. The belief that they will not be afforded the same opportunities as white coaches is so ubiquitous that it discourages that idea from ever even taking hold. Often that is because others who have tried to go down that route, or who know those that have, only to find, or at least feel as though the odds are firmly stacked against them, advise them that it's not worthwhile. Representation has become a bit of a buzzword in recent years, often loathed by both conservatives and progressives alike, albeit for very different reasons, but there is absolutely no doubt that in many fields it makes an enormous difference. If there is no one, or virtually no one, who looks anything like you in a certain field, it's rare that people can imagine themselves doing that thing. If you're a black footballer aged, let's say, 28 to 35 plus, and you have never had a black manager, any senior black coaches, and see almost exclusively white faces throughout the Football League pyramid, the subconscious message that you're getting is that it isn't viable or realistic as a career path for you without it ever actually having to be spelt out like that. If you were to say that black people couldn't play football as well as white people now, in the year 2023, even devout racists would laugh you out of the room because it is provably false and patently absurd. Before the likes of Arthur Friedenreich, Jose Andrade, and Leonidas broke through that glass ceiling though, that was quite a widely held belief, and a claim that a lot of people made. At the 1924 Summer Olympics in Paris, Andrade became the first black player to play football at the Games, which was the biggest tournament in international football at the time and provided the precursor to FIFA founding the World Cup. Andrade was also the only black player in the Uruguay team, as the son of a West African-born slave who had escaped from a plantation in Brazil and fled to Uruguay, where slavery had been made illegal. He was therefore considered something of a novelty to a European audience when the tournament began, a full 12 years it should be said, before Jesse Owens dispelled the Nazi myth of Aryan supremacy at the Olympics in Berlin. By the end of the tournament, Andrade was universally regarded as the best footballer on the planet, earning the nickname the Black Marvel. Sometimes perceptions and misconceptions can shift very quickly. Other times, they can prove to be much more persistent. Right the way through to the 1990s, it was still a commonly held view here in the United Kingdom and throughout much of Europe, sometimes verbalised but more often just tacitly accepted, that black footballers could be quick, powerful, and even skillful, but that they lacked the intelligence, vision, and composure of their white peers. For that reason, young black footballers in academies and youth team football were often pushed out wide onto the wings, into attack, or out to fullback, roles which were supposed to be better suited to their perceived attributes, even if that perception had zero basis in fact. Ron Nodes, who was the chairman of Wimbledon, Crystal Palace and Brentford at various stages throughout his 3 decades in football, commented on the racial makeup of his Crystal Palace team in 1991 that, quote, "The black players at this club lend the side a lot of skill and flair, but you also need white players in there to balance things up and give the team some brains and some common sense." End quote. It was rare for someone to put it quite so bluntly, but Nodes' blatantly racist remarks reflected a broader view that was by no means unique to him in English football at the time. Do you imagine then that Ron Nodes, who was the majority shareholder at Brentford all the way until 2006, was ever likely to appoint a black manager when he believed that black people lacked brains and common sense? It seems unlikely to me. It is absurd, of course, that these stereotypes lived on for so long. Nodes made those comments a full 67 years after Jose Andrade had lit up the Olympic Games by dictating games with his vision and reading of the game from what we would now call holding midfield, more than 30 years after Gigia was the standout central midfielder at 2 successive World Cups, and a similar amount of time on from Pele establishing himself from his teenage years onwards as one of the most creative and intelligent forwards of all time, a description of him which still holds just as true to this day. But hey, racial prejudice is one hell of a drug. It can make you watch Frank Rijkaard make successive Ballon d'Or podiums in 1988 and 1989, and Ruud Gullit win the award as 2 of the most tactically versatile and intelligent players ever to have laced up a pair of boots, and then, 5 minutes later, still claim that black footballers lack brains and need to be, quote, balanced out by their super intelligent white counterparts. Like, Alan Pardew. Crystal Palace's top scorer that season, incidentally, was Mark Bright, whose 22 goals kept the Eagles in the First Division. The season before that, it was Ian Wright with 25 goals, then Bright again with 17, Wright with 33, you get the idea. Nodes would no doubt be rolling in his grave if he could see the likes of Michael Olise, Eberechi Eze and Wilfred Zaha being hailed as Palace's star men now, despite their apparent lack of common sense. You might think that this all sounds terrible, but thankfully it is a thing of the past, and in some ways it is. Even in England now, the idea that a black footballer couldn't do an expert job in holding midfield or as a number 10 would seem preposterous to most people. The job of shielding a back four was, for a long time at least, and sometimes still to this day, renamed the Makelele role in England after Claude Makelele. Gilberto Silva performed an equally important role in the same position, at roughly the same time at Arsenal, Patrick Vieira is perhaps the best all-round box-to-box midfielder ever to have graced the division. There was nothing that Yaya Toure couldn't do during the 2013-14 season, which is arguably the most impressive that any Premier League midfielder has ever had. N'Golo Kante, at his best, is probably the single most effective Premier League midfielder of the past decade in terms of his ability to dictate the outcome of a game. Now no one would look at an 18-year-old Romeo Lavia, for instance, who shone so brightly at relegated Southampton last season, and say that he wasn't cut out to play in holding midfield, or that he should be retrained to play on the wing. In other ways, however, it hasn't. A study carried out by the Danish research firm Run Repeat 3 years ago, which analysed more than 2,000 statements from commentary on 80 games across the Premier League, Serie A, La Liga and Ligue 1, found that the language used to describe black players remains distinctly racially coded. Whereas light-skinned players were most likely to be praised by commentators for their intelligence, hard work, and quality, players with darker skin were far more likely to be criticised for lacking intelligence and quality. Remarkably, commentators were 6.59 times more likely to talk about the power of a player with darker skin and 3.38 times more likely to draw reference to their pace. Of course, as so often crops up when these kind of reports are mentioned, there are very quick, powerful, and athletic black footballers. No one is suggesting that commentators shouldn't be able to acknowledge that Kyle Walker or Kylian Mbappe are quite quick, or that Virgil van Dijk and Romelu Lukaku are fairly strong. The issue is how much focus is put on those attributes alone in comparison to equally quick and strong lighter skin players, and, quite often, how those attributes are highlighted even when those claims are almost entirely nonsensical. I distinctly remember, for instance, when Liverpool first signed Naby Keita, Danny Murphy very confidently stating on national television, quote, "What I would say is, he's obviously very athletic, got a lot of qualities, a bit like Jordan Henderson has. Professional, good athlete, does his job really, really well. But he isn't creative enough if you want to challenge for the title and the Champions League. Someone like Gerrard, Souness, Alonso, Mascherano, these types of players." End quote. What is clear, right off the bat, is that Murphy had never watched Keita play, or that if he had, he was paying precisely zero attention. It's notable, though, that the first attribute he highlighted was Keita's athleticism, despite that never being an aspect of his game that Keita was renowned for. Quite the opposite, in fact. The 4 creative ex-Liverpool players that Murphy highlighted, meanwhile, all white, just saying, and cited as being a single profile of player, included Graham Souness and Javier Mascherano, alongside Steven Gerrard. Souness was a magnificent player, but he was best known for his tough tackling, industry, and leadership qualities. He could pass a ball very well, but it was rarely the final ball that Murphy seemed to be alluding to. Mascherano, even more ludicrously, was literally a shield who sat in front of the back four for Liverpool. He never beat players, went on mazy runs, or looked to unlock defences. He was a terrier who sniffed out danger, nullified attacks, and then laid the ball off to more creative teammates. After he left Liverpool, Pep Guardiola quite literally turned him into a centre-back. Xavi or Andre Iniesta, he most certainly was not. Again, none of this is to say that Danny Murphy is a racist, per se, or that any football commentators are for that matter, but these are centuries-old stereotypes that are still firmly ingrained in the European psyche. It would be foolish to assume that they could be dispelled in 1 or 2 generations, even when all of the evidence illustrates that they're nonsense and the data proves how prevalent they remain. Even now, black goalkeepers talk about facing similar hurdles as black holding midfielders and playmakers did 20 or 30 years ago. David James, who is England's only ever black number 1, made a really interesting film a few months ago that I would highly recommend, talking to the small number of black goalkeepers, both past and present, who have played in the English game. One of the most notable current examples, Wes Foderingham, who just won promotion to the Premier League with Sheffield United as their number one, described the stigma around black goalkeepers that they're somewhat not trustworthy that he felt growing up. Foderingham spoke of how, even in football, when he said that he was a footballer to people as a youngster, the first question would be whether he was a winger, and that there was always a palpable sense of surprise when he said that he was a goalkeeper. Foderingham is an active player, aged 32, and his experience was not an isolated one. If you take footballers with African citizenship, of those who play in Europe's top 5 leagues, 35% are forwards, 29% are midfielders, 32% are defenders, and less than 4%, 3.52% to be exact, are goalkeepers. Of course, there are more forwards, midfielders, and defenders in most squads than goalkeepers regardless, but even equalising for that fact, you would still expect that figure to be significantly higher than 3.52%. Hopefully, 2 of the 5 or 6 best goalkeepers in European football right now being black, one of whom is an African international, will go some way towards redressing those stereotypes. In some senses, the lack of representation when it comes to black managers can create a self-fulfilling prophecy. If black players, or even non-players, don't try to become coaches because they don't think that it is attainable, then they are ensuring that there won't be any black coaches, whether their assessment was accurate or not. It creates a vicious cycle. However, whilst we know that a lot of black players are discouraged right off the bat, many do still attempt to break the cycle. Between 2004 and 2020, research by the Black Footballers Partnership found 23% of all coaching badges were obtained by black former players, in addition to 14% of UEFA Pro license holders, which is the top coaching qualification required to manage at the highest level. That shows that black players and former players are still underrepresented when it comes to obtaining licenses, with roughly half as many obtaining licenses as we might expect, but they are nowhere near as underrepresented there as they are too when it comes to actually getting jobs. So even the lack of representation doesn't come close to fully explaining the lack of opportunities. So what's the problem there? One suggestion is the abject lack of diversity within the senior management of clubs themselves. Whilst black people are massively underrepresented in coaching, it doesn't come close to how underrepresented they are at senior and boardroom level. There are no black owners of Premier League teams. There is just one black owner out of all 92 Premier League and EFL teams. There are only 2 black directors of football across those same 92 clubs. Only 1.6% of executive leadership and ownership positions across the Premier League and EFL are occupied by black people. 8 out of the 13 Premier League teams who reported these statistics in 2022 had 0 diversity hires within their senior leadership. 4 out of 19 had none in team operations. 9 out of 17 didn't have a single one in their entire coaching team. There are no black chief scouts or heads of recruitment in the Premier League, and just one goalkeeping coach. Ashley Williams, who did his coaching badges after retiring from football in 2021 before turning his attention to punditry instead, has commented upon the fact that, from his experience, black players tend not to have as close relationships with the almost exclusively white coaches, technical directors, senior management, chairmen and owners of clubs as many of their white counterparts. Given that it is often through those connections, developed during their playing days, that players will undertake their coaching badges and be offered their first jobs in coaching, it seems likely that is one avenue that is greatly restricted for black players. It is hard to imagine if 43% of Premier League owners and senior directors were black, equalising their representation with players, that there wouldn't be considerably more black coaches and managers. I've talked a lot about unconscious bias, disenfranchisement, and a lack of representation at every level in this video, because I think they are the biggest issues holding back aspiring or potential black coaches. When a lot of white people hear racism being cited as the reason why there are so few black managers, I think that some of them seem to get the idea that People are suggesting all 92 Premier League and EFL owners are card-carrying Britain First or Patriotic Alternative members who refuse to hire black managers outright because of their virulent and unrelenting white supremacist beliefs. That's not really what people are saying, though. You don't need Premier League chairmen to be covered in swastika tattoos or dressed up in KKK hoods for them to fall prey to still pervasive centuries-old stereotypes and unconscious bias. It would be foolish, however, and much worse still, inaccurate, not to acknowledge that there is also an element of just outright, not at all coded, plain as day racism that is very much alive and well in football. Former Leeds United and Cagliari owner Massimo Cellino, who is now the owner and president of Brescia, said of Mario Balotelli that, quote, "What can I say? That he's black and he's working to whiten himself, but he has great difficulties in this," after Brescia signed Balotelli in 2019. Cellino later explained that it was a joke that had been misunderstood. I hate it when that happens. At around the same time, German meat processing billionaire and Schalke chairman Clemens Tönnies stated that instead of raising taxes to combat climate change, Germany should build power stations in Africa so that, quote, "the Africans would stop cutting down trees and produce babies when it's dark," end quote. It was explained to Tönnies that Germany emits more carbon dioxide with less than 7% of the population than the entire continent of Africa, and several African former Schalke players called for his dismissal. Tönnies was suspended for just 3 months. In the end, it was Schalke's wretched results that cost him his job. Former Wigan Athletic owner and chairman Dave Whelan claimed that there was, quote, "nothing wrong with calling a Chinaman a chink and that, quote, Jewish people chase money more than everybody else," when defending his appointment of Malky Mackay, who had made similar comments in a series of leaked text messages at Cardiff City. Another one of the messages between Mackay and Cardiff's head of recruitment Ian Moody, in response to a list of transfer targets, read, "Not many white faces amongst that lot, but worth considering," end quote. There are many more examples. It's just 2 years since the fallout from England's defeat on penalties to Italy in the final of Euro 2020, which saw Marcus Rashford, Jadon Sancho and Bukayo Saka subject to a barrage of racist abuse. There was a raft of black footballers who received racist abuse both online and in stadiums last season, some of which resulted in arrests, convictions, or stadium bans. The scandals surrounding Romelu Lukaku in Italy and Vinicius Jr. in Spain's racial abuse both came in 2023, and I defy anyone who paid any attention to either of them to come away with the conclusion that racism isn't still rampant within the European game. One of the criticisms of black coaches, or aspiring black coaches, is that they expect to walk into top jobs. From experience, with perhaps only a few exceptions, I don't believe that that is remotely true, and certainly not to any greater extent than it is for white coaches. The difference, however, is that there are several white ex-players who have actually walked pretty much straight into top jobs with very little experience, and virtually no comparable situations involving black ex-players. Frank Lampard and Steven Gerrard, despite being wonderful players, I don't think that it is too unkind to suggest are two of the least capable managers in the history of the Premier League. And the less said about Phil Neville, the better. I actually find that is quite a useful rule for life, not just within this context. Lampard's first job was at big spending Derby County, who he took from 6th place all the way up to the dizzying heights of 6th place with the help of a few outstanding Chelsea loanees before losing in the Championship playoffs. Then he walked into the top job at Chelsea, who had just finished 3rd in the Premier League, where he was sacked, with the Blues down in 9th, followed by Everton, who were 16th when he arrived, and 19th when he was sacked. And naturally, that was good enough to see him temporarily reappointed by Chelsea, who he helped to a 12th place finish last season. Gerrard, meanwhile, got his first senior job at Rangers after just a year coaching Liverpool's youth teams, where he won 1 trophy in 3 years with Michael Beale as his assistant, before doing a disastrous job without Beale at Aston Villa, who were transformed last season following Gerrard's sacking and replacement with Unai Emery. Yet Sol Campbell's first job was at Macclesfield Town, who were rock bottom of League 2 at the time, 5 points from safety. Ashley Cole has been coaching for more than 4 years now, but has only ever held roles working underneath Lampard. Cole and Campbell are 2 of England and arguably the world's best defenders of the Premier League era. I'm not saying that they deserved to walk into top jobs, but it's clear that some fantastic former players are afforded those opportunities, whilst others are not. There's also another hitch when it comes to the claim that black coaches just need to start from the bottom and work their way up. EFL chairmen and owners are seemingly even less willing to appoint black coaches than Premier League teams, and League 2, the bottom division within the EFL, being the worst offender of all when it comes to appointing managers from black and ethnic minority backgrounds. In short, black coaches don't get to walk straight into top jobs like a small number of white coaches, but they also struggle to get offered jobs at the very lowest level from which they might be able to work their way up the pyramid. I must admit also that when I looked into the actual record of black managers within the Premier League and the EFL, most fared a lot better than I had expected, given how often it is said that the reason why there are so few of them is because they're all rubbish. Even Sol Campbell, who is frequently mocked and certainly has some views that I disagree with, he took Macclesfield, who were 5 points from safety, being hounded by HMRC and have since gone under, to safety in League 2, with 8 wins and 12 draws from 30 games in charge. Whether it be Patrick Vieira at Crystal Palace, Chris Hughton at a handful of clubs, Darren Moore at Sheffield Wednesday, Liam Rosenior now at Hull City, Nuno Espirito Santo at Wolves, or Vincent Kompany at Burnley, there are lots of success stories out there. Sure, they have all, or at some stage will all get sacked for poor results, but that is true of literally every manager in world football other than Jurgen Klopp and Pep Guardiola, regardless of their skin colour. One suggestion for addressing the lack of diversity in management is the Rooney Rule, adopted by the NFL, which mandates clubs to interview at least one ethnic minority candidate whenever they have a vacancy. Though, it should be said, it has had little impact in the NFL. The NBA has actually been more effective in rectifying the lack of black representation in coaching without the Rooney Rule than the NFL. Black coaches are underrepresented by a ratio of 3-1 still compared to black players in the NBA, which isn't great of course, but it is a sizable improvement on the more than 10-1 ratio which is found in the Premier League, and even worse in the EFL. It should be stressed, English football is not unique on this front. It's a similar story throughout most of Europe and all of the continent's Big 5 leagues. There is just lots of data in England and, quite frankly, it would take forever to use 15 different examples for every single data point. So no, surprisingly, black people aren't genetically incapable of becoming or of wanting to become good football managers. And nor are most football chairmen the ideological peers of Reinhard Heydrich. Almost every black coach or aspiring black coach describes similar experiences of the numerous extra hurdles facing them, and personally, I think that you would have to be as brainless as Ron Nodes thought all black people were in 1991 to ignore those testimonies and experiences and write them off as some kind of collective delusion and grand conspiracy. Ultimately, until there is far more diversity at every level of football, from the owners through to the scouts, technical directors and administrators, that is unlikely to change. Trailblazers and wildly successful black head coaches, of which Vincent Kompany, or I selfishly hope Liam Rosenior could be the first, will help of course, increasing representation within the upper echelons of the game and giving black players the belief that a successful career in management is even possible. One thing is for certain though, before there is widespread acceptance that there is a problem at all, whilst we might get the occasional lip service, nothing serious will ever be done to fix it. That is it for today's video, but thank you all very much, as ever, for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it or found it in any way interesting or provoking. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, of course. Try not to be, like outrageously racist. Just do your best if you can. And also, obviously, it goes without saying, make sure that you are subscribed to this channel and my backup channel, both of which should be on your screen or about to appear on your screens now, along with a couple of videos that you might want to watch after this one. You can also find me on Twitter or on Instagram via the username @HITC Sevens on both, should you wish to do so.